Welcome to the OC24 podcast, where we've taken some of the best talks and discussions from this year's 24-hour conference on global organised crime, which showcases some of the most interesting research into organised crime around the world. This episode's called A Critical Review of Mexico's Security Policy.
Good evening, everyone. Good morning, everyone, depending on where you're joining us from. Welcome to this session here in the 24-hour conference on Mexico's security policy. And so I think our panelists, you can do it as I announce you, as if you're coming on stage. But my name is Zara Snapp from Instituto RIA in Mexico, and we're an organization that does advocacy and research on drug policies around a peace-building, social justice, and development framework. And I'm really excited about the panel that we're going to have today because we were proposing this at Instituto RIA, and I'm so glad that it's actually happening. So I want to thank the conference for accepting it, and I'm going to start introducing our panelists so we can get right into it. So first we have Luis Daniel Santiago. He is an analyst at Instituto RIA, and he's currently and also has other work doing political analysis and electoral strategizing. And so right now he's in Colombia working on a campaign there. So he's joining us from Bogota. Welcome. Then we have Dawn Marie Paley, who is from the Universidad Autónoma de Puebla. She's a Dr. Dawn, also the author of Drug War Capitalism and Neoliberal War. I just wanted to bring together people I admire so that we could have an interesting conversation. So thank you, Dawn, for being here today. And finally, Oswaldo Zavala, who's a professor of Latin American literature and culture at City University of New York, and also the author of Cartels Don't Exist. I recommend all of these books and all of these authors. So what we're going to do during this session is there will be first, Luis Daniel is going to speak for a few minutes, for 5 to 7 minutes, then Dawn, and finally Oswaldo. And, we really wanted to bring up this session because we want it to be a bit of a critique on both what's going on in Mexico and also a questioning, kind of this examining of, have we actually changed in strategy? Has militarized strategy around security, has it transformed in the last 3 years, which have been under current President Andrés Manuel López Obrador? What are we witnessing? What can we learn from the past? And then what do we think about the future? And also just a bit to explore and question a bit our ideas around what is organized crime. How are we homogenizing a group that maybe needs to be more diversified in our undertaking of our studies around groups that both interact and that form part of many of the communities, obviously here in Mexico. So we're gonna be exploring all of that tonight. We have an hour. We're starting right on time, and so I'm going to pass the microphone to Luis Daniel Santiago to start. Thank you. Welcome.
Thank you, Sara. Hello, everyone. My name is Luis Daniel Santiago. I'm from Mexico City, currently living in Bogota, Colombia. I'm a communications consultant and data analyst. And as Sara said, we're going to dive into what is going on towards the fight of organized crime regarding cartels and drug trafficking organizations. And right now I'm going to set the context towards the strategy that has been implemented in Mexico throughout the better part of 15 years. And how has it become the main strategy towards fighting organized crime? It's called the kingpin strategy in Mexico. Why it failed, and why, even though it has been failing, it's still being implemented. So a bit of context. The main objective of the so-called kingpin strategy, or the kingpin approach towards organized crime, is in the criminal, not on the crime itself. It's to attack the perpetrator, not attacking the causes that leads a person to engage in criminal activity. Now, this strategy has been the paradigm that has been dictated and promoted and supported by the US through organizations such as the Drug Enforcement Agency, the DEA, as its main policy towards combating drug trafficking organizations. And it has been implemented in multiple Latin American countries, not just in Mexico. And even though its implementation in Mexico began as early as 1997, it was in late 2006 and early 2007 that this approach really gained like sort of a big momentum and a leading role in Mexico's own security policy. Was that the then newly elected president of Mexico, Calderon, chose to, as a foreign policy and as a security policy, to have a close relationship with the United States in security matters. Much like also then president of Colombia, Álvaro Uribe, who also engaged in a close relationship with the Bush administration towards fighting the guerrilla groups such as FARC and ELN here in Colombia. And this proximity really facilitated the negotiation of multiple year deals and agreements, such as the Merida Initiative, through which the US funneled significant means and resources for the Mexican government to be used in fighting the drug trafficking organizations. And many of these means and resources came in the form of military assistance, of money, or in equipment, but also it came in the form of defining or having an influence in the definition of which were the targets that were going to be targeted, sorry for using the same word, by the Mexican forces, and also in applying pressure in the Mexican judicial branch so that to facilitate the extradition of priority targets to be tried on American soil. And now there's substantial evidence right now that shows that the kingpin strategy not only has not been a factor in reducing the power of these criminal enterprises, but has rather enabled violence and fostered the creation of new, smaller groups. And here's the tricky part: in spite of this same strategy is still producing certain metrics that may show that the strategy itself is a success, since it takes into account certain metrics such as the amount of lieutenants and kingpins that are captured. It can certainly be seen as a success. Both former President Felipe Calderón and his successor, Enrique Peña Nieto, we're talking about here of the two presidents that governed Mexico from 2006 to 2018, they both achieved tangible goals set through this strategy, despite the fact that it had little to no effect on improving the security situation in the country. And I can throw you a lot of metrics and a lot of data that show that this is a failure, but the one that it's most clear and most transparent is the fact that between 2006 and 2018 alone, these two periods of time in which this strategy has been really implemented, Mexico has reported over 250,000 of homicides. There's no clearer fact than that. And even though the then new president of Mexico in 2018, Andrés Manuel López Obrador, current president of Mexico, had been a fierce critic of this strategy and promised a change of policy once he got into office, 3 years into his administration, actually, today marks the third anniversary that his administration began. There is clear evidence that this strategy is still being implemented and it is still not producing any results in reducing the level of violence or the reach of the drug trafficking organizations. And one may ask, why is this still being implemented even though there's substantial evidence that it doesn't work? Because it's an easy sell. Politically speaking, it's easier to explain in simple metrics a strategy or the implementation of a strategy through the kingpin strategy, because you're measuring in your success or failure based on the amount of people you capture, lieutenants and kingpins, of the money that you may capture through money laundering or other activities. And that's an easy sell politically speaking, and it can generate headlines. Many of us can remember these splashy headlines used by the Mexican military and the Mexican security forces of they grabbing a kingpin or a lieutenant with a whole bunch of drugs and money and arms. And it's a tangible way to show that they are working, even though there is no sign that this actually works. And actually the evidence is quite the contrary. And the sad part of it is that one of the most fierce critics of these strategies is going down the same lane, implementing the same key policy that he was right on the spot criticizing his predecessors about doing this. And the tragic part is that there are huge parts of Mexico that have been really affected by the side effects of using like a sword to take down the head of a criminal enterprise and the cells that it generates throughout this approach. And I yield the rest of my time.
Yeah, not the problem. Yeah, and really you give us a perfect segue into, you bring up a lot of points that I hope I can come back to in the questions around indicators around the Merida initiative. And I'm going to pass the proverbial microphone to Dawn, who's going to speak a bit about the history of militarization in Mexico. And she's also done a lot of work on búsqueda, on the search for people who are disappeared. So I'm sure she'll comment on that as well. Thank you, Dawn. Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Zara. And thanks for everyone who's here with us. So I actually just have a really short list of bullet points of things that came into my mind as important to share in this 5 minutes, right? So it's very sort of top line. But I want to start just by saying that I think it's really important to analyze organized crime, not as something that's exceptional or something that's occurring outside of states or capitalism. We actually need interdisciplinary approaches that ask how organized crime interacts with and impacts nation state and global capital, as well as social reproduction and social movements. So coming to, even just the idea of being part of a conference on organized crime makes me cringe a little bit, especially when the focus really is on this notion of criminal groups and not on states and the economic system within which we're living. Because I think any analysis that we do on organized crime that does not situate it within the context of actually existing capitalism, that does not analyze political power and how it's being used by who, will always produce analysis that are very partial, and it will lead to proposals that are Band-Aid solutions or non-solutions to violence and to the drug trade. I also just wanted to, I guess as a way of illustrating this, what I consider this urgent need to think about organized crime as intricately linked with the state and capitalism. I wanted to just touch on the capture of Genaro Garcia Luna in 2018 and General Salvador Cienfuegos in 2020 in the US. So for those who aren't familiar, Garcia Luna was the head of the federal police in Mexico. He was Felipe Calderon's head of public security, and he was accused of trafficking in collaboration with the Sinaloa cartel. He's currently in prison in the United States. And Cienfuegos was the head of the Army and the Air Force in Mexico during Peña Nieto's administration. He was a Secretary of Defense, and he was arrested last year. He's now a free man here in Mexico. So I think these events, the capture of these two men, is often presented as Garcia Luna and Cienfuegos are working for organized crime. But in fact, we don't necessarily have the empirical evidence to prove that, just like many, many, many of the things that we tend to take for granted or that are part of sort of a received wisdom about organized crime. And I think the question that we need to ask is it possible that organized crime was working for them, right? And taking that question seriously is really urgent. And it's a very complex task, obviously, but that kind of interrogation of the relationship between these two men who were the head of security apparatus in Mexico during this intense drug war that has been so tragic for so many hundreds of thousands of families, we need really thinking about it seriously is going to force us to rethink the whole war on drugs. And I think that's where we need to go right now in terms of our analysis and changing the discourse. Finally, I just wanted to say, and this echoes a little bit what Luis Daniel was saying, is that the Mexican Army and Marines are still heavily involved in the war on drugs to this day. I'm going to quote from a new article by Rangel Treviño, which is from 2021. And he says, between 2006 and 2020, each new administration has deployed a new discourse to make the war on drugs, the use of military for police operations, and the sustained growth in the homicide rate more acceptable. The rhetoric may change, but the strategy to deal with illicit drug markets remains without significant changes in practice. And to close, I just want to share my concern, my deep concern, with the Mexican Army's increasing participation in civilian life, from the control of ports to the building and operating of priority infrastructure projects. And particularly in this context in which the armed forces are being deployed in the streets throughout the country at record levels. So this is something that I think we also need to think about within the context of understanding organized crime and the war on drugs. Thank you.
Thank you, Dawn. That's exactly why I wanted to have this conversation. And I wanted to have it within, as soon as the email came about it, this is a space to question what we've been, to question how this is even being presented, how we as part of, as academics, as professors, as journalists, as civil society, how it's also our duty to question what's being laid out as if it was a fact. And we'll get more into that, I'm sure, after Oswaldo. And the point about the rhetoric and the official discourse, I think, leads us perfectly into Oswaldo. Muchas gracias por estar.
Thank you. Thank you, Zara, for organizing the panel. A pleasure to be here with all these colleagues. I'll read a brief paper and then I guess we'll move on the discussion. The Mexican and the US governments announced on September 27th the so-called Bicentennial Framework for Security, Public Health, and Safe Communities, as they named it, a binational agreement claiming to be designed primarily to protect the health and safety of our citizens, I'm quoting from the document, and promote the development of the most vulnerable communities in both countries, prevent criminal organizations from harming our countries, and pursue and bring criminals to justice. This agreement, in my opinion, follows the López Obrador government's move to revise its own national security law that resulted, as we know, in a closer monitoring of DEA agents in Mexico, suspending and reframing the Mérida Initiative and demanding stricter gun regulation in the US to curtail the contraband of weapons into Mexico. This, discussions that I think we're all aware of. The Bicentennial Agreement seems, at least on the surface, like a complacent response on the part of the US to accept the implied criticism on the otherwise disastrous and, of course, even criminal anti-drug policy that led Mexico into a violent era of militarization that is yet to end. On the other hand, it seems to reinstate, as Dawn and Daniel have suggested, the most typical securitarian aspects of the war against drugs, namely to disrupt transnational criminal organizations, or TCOs, as the pseudo-technical name is usually circulated in official institutions instead of the more vulgar cartels. And I would like to dwell in this contradiction. I am always intrigued by the rhetoric of the drug war in such agreements. Criminologist Diana Gordon once called it drug speak. That is their willing discourse vigorously practiced from the White House and the US political class to legitimize anti-drug policy in its punitive logic. It is based on the, and I quote, demonization of the dealer transformed into a vampire, a mule, a gang member, or even the fantasy of the narco-terrorist that we often hear in the media. And in some, the perception of the war on drugs is a kind of a holy crusade that would ultimately be designated as a national security threat in the 1980s. David McIntyre has argued that the national security strategy would come to, quote, dominate military and diplomatic activities and often the national political scene so perniciously that it now connects both homeland security and US geopolitics interests abroad. And this is where perhaps the López Obrador government is hardly different from the process of militarization of the global South, a trend that Jeff Halper has famously equated with the military occupation of Palestine. Isn't this the logical effect of the decades-long process of what scholar Maria Jose Rodriguez Rejas has called the de-Americanization of security in Latin America? Yes, but I think with one key difference. AMLO seems to have decided on a domestic politicization of the national security paradigm. And by this, I want to spend some time talking on the way he refuses to call drug cartels a national security threat, the famous hugs, not bullets policy. And he has been able to successfully set new terms into the binational anti-drug policy, at least in discourse, right, as we saw from the Bicentennial Agreement. And while he has taken the country into a risky path of assigning unprecedented administrative roles to the armed forces, the control of the Mexican borders, the custom ports of entry, the Felipe Ángeles Mexico City airport, the distribution of the COVID vaccine, and so on, I would not venture as far as to call this a full process of militarization of public life, as some have denounced with alarm. AMLO's militarism, as others have observed, is also heavily directed at infrastructure duties, including the construction of the Mayan train, the Interoceanic Corridor, or even 2,700 branches of the Welfare Bank, a federal institution for the funding of social programs across the country. Now, this being said, it is true that lately AMLO shocked public opinion by declaring that his infrastructure projects should move on a fast track because they are also now a matter, he says, of national security. But here is exactly where I find the most fascinating moment of Mexico's current security paradigm. The concept of national security has been historically controlled by US hegemony. It is a political and cultural field on its own, inscribed as the constitutive aspect of global geopolitics. Securitarianism, or the operational logic of national security, has thus become a structure that invades and transforms the domestic political life and practically the entire world, because it has been the mechanism to name contingent threats emerging in subsequent decades. Of course, communism, undocumented migration, terrorism, and of course, drug trafficking. And here, of course, is where I join Don Paley's criticism to the idea of this conference, right? Solely devoted to organized crime, because it seems to fall trap directly to the most hegemonic national security agenda, or at least the later stage of this agenda. In Mexico, the idea of national security has been internalized to such an extent that the bicameral commission of the Congress speaks of a culture of national security in which the very concept has become a comprehensive matrix of state policies that are now framed under a single governmentality. In this context, AMLO's appropriation of national security, and this is where I will finish my intervention, is twofold. On one hand, he seems to offer the reorientation of the militarization as a workforce for his infrastructure projects, at least publicly renouncing the open drug war that had been in the past nothing but a war against poor and vulnerable people. Although, as it had been suggested by Don and Daniel, his armed forces lethality conducting anti-drug operation has in fact increased. And this is surely the most sensible caveat that we must keep in mind. And second, the transferring of the national security designation to those very projects, some of them aimed at the extractive industry, a sector previously linked to the aggressive militarization, depopulation of strategies of the Calderón and Peña Nieto governments. I am, of course, not approving of his policies with this because, of course, as we know, they're wide open to corruption and army cronyism. But to simply dismiss AMLO's government as the blind empowerment of the armed forces, leading to some kind of codependency between civil and military power, I think is to remain on the critical surface of all these events. Perhaps our attention should also focus on the very nature of the global security paradigm and the way governments in the global south are disputing or should dispute US hegemony in the region by adapting proactively around the securitarian governmentality of their own design, instead of simply reacting as subalterns of foreign wars, as Colombian journalist Germán Castro Caicedo once called them. And with this, I would just simply add that the combination of the energy policy and the security policy of the Oswaldo government and the conflating of the two under the national security question, for me, is the key moment of his presidency that we must continue to examine. And of course, it's not exempt of contradictions and difficulty to just simply understand where it's going to. But I'll leave it at that.
Thank you, Oswaldo. I'm always left with these, in these sessions, well, in these conversations with people like you and Don and Luis Daniel, with more questions than answers. And so we're going to see how we work with that. I'm wondering if we can, if we all turn on our cameras, then we can kind of speak to each other. And I'm just going to pose a couple of questions. I want to take up the issue around rhetoric and what you were talking about, Oswaldo, around and this is all of you have kind of mentioned it. It's almost like there's been a play going on during various in several administrations. No, Luis Daniel talked about showing criminals with guns and drugs. Don spoke about who was working for whom, which I think is a question that we really need to be asking. And I've always thought about that. When supposedly an organized criminal group was paying the government a certain amount of money, or was the government extorting that criminal group for that amount of money? I mean, who was in a position of power in those transactions? And then just thinking about how he has changed, this drug speak that we fall into, and how, he says hugs, not bullets. He goes and he visits El Chapo Guzman's mother and hugs her. But then he's running a campaign in Mexico that highly stigmatizes anybody who has any contact with the drug market. So it's in the drugs, there is no happy ending. I mean, that is, if you use drugs, there's no happy ending in your life. And so it's these mixed messages of not knowing, what should we be worried about? What should we be paying attention to? Because there's too much going on all at once, and you don't know if you're watching a show and a facade that's being placed in front of you, or whether you're being given clear information. If that wasn't even a question, I want to know if we can just, like, between all of us, and I don't know if it's possible from the technical people, if we can all see each other on the screen, and then if we can
to take,
because I would just open it up to
right,
so we can speak.
To take on your comment on the contradictions of his policy, what I would add to that is that the national security narrative is contradiction itself, right? It's built upon contradiction and contradiction. The idea simply that the drug organizations are just so powerful that can challenge the state, that they can somehow have a presence in over 100 countries and control the drug markets in the United States, exactly at the time where we're living one of the most heavily militarized moments in Mexican history, is just in itself ludicrous, right? And this is where exactly I think a lot of the public debate on security falls trapped into, because on one hand, we seem to accept blindly the idea that cartels are out there really doing all this violence. But on the other hand, we want to put into question the heavy military power and the territorial control they exert unprecedented in the Mexican land, all over the place, and in all the institutions. And so how do we reconcile that? Well, I think in order to do that, we need to get past just all the assumptions of the national security paradigm. And I think this is where we need to simply cancel the idea of talking about TCOs or cartels or extortion or derecho de piso and all this vocabulary that seems to already implied a story in itself and some sort of an answer if we want to really get past the problematic use of all this language.
Don, do you want to comment on this?
Yeah, like I agree with what Oswaldo said, and I think thinking beyond getting past that language is also what language comes in. How do we talk about what's happening? Because it's not like we can just eliminate the way that we're currently talking about what's taking place in Mexico. We need to be able to talk about exactly what is going on. In drug war capitalism, I propose the idea of, for example, of talking about paramilitary groups instead of talking about drug cartels, which I think can help us as scholars, as activists, as journalists, understand how these groups have relationships with different parts of the state security apparatus. And that understanding is extremely complex, very hard to document. I know, as a young intern at the Globe and Mail in Canada, how the mainstream news works, mainstream newspapers, and it's basically reprinting police press releases, right? And this happens all over the place. So state, right? Doing that extra work to figure out who's actually involved in this, what branches of the state security apparatus are participating with what non-state armed groups, paramilitary groups, is exceedingly dangerous work. But I do think, for example, so moving towards talking about paramilitarism, and when I researched paramilitarism in Colombia, I learned that was actually a struggle by Colombian activists to use the word paramilitaries. The Colombian government didn't start talking about paramilitaries. It was through social struggle and through folks going and doing advocacy with Congress people that they were able to move the discourse. And imagine if we had to talk about Colombia now without being able to talk about paramilitary groups. And because obviously the Colombian state is still trying to push in that direction. They talk about BACRIM now, right? Bandas criminales, sort of very depoliticized language that also tells us constantly that there is a separation between state forces and these groups. So I think I would just add that, I guess, into the mix in terms of like, where do we go? Like narcofosas, for example, which was a very used word, I would say, as recently as a couple of years ago. I feel like that's kind of now fallen out of favor. I started noticing it being used less after all those truckloads of human bodies were found in Jalisco that were stored by government officials illegally, talking about clandestine mass graves, right? Mm-hmm. And these kind of moves are really important in terms of destigmatization and in terms of potential to get out of the situation that we're in.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think we have witnessed, and you both touched on it, this idea that anytime you just connect something with the word narco, then we can criminalize any of those activities. So narco-terrorism, narcofosas, narcomenudistas, which are small-scale dealers within the Mexican criminal justice system, but really just means that you're possessing above a certain amount of substances. And so there is this very intentional purpose in isolating and creating the other and making the other a very large group. And so I think it's like, what do we use to fill in the terms to create that nuance that we know exists in our countries and in our country and in our communities? No, of like, it's all much more mixed than the government would like to make it seem. Luis Daniel, I don't know if you want to comment on this or if I should go on to my next.
Yes, just to add this to this sort of confusion or this narrative that of mixed messages that we have received from current President López Obrador, which you mentioned, and I'm quite agree. I would add the ambiguity with which he has managed the whole regularization of adult use of cannabis, even though his own country and his own party, has been the promoter of such laws that are now. I mean, it has been a slow process, but it's moving slowly, but it's moving, fortunately. And he has been quite ambiguous on that subject, not speaking quite openly for it, but not demonizing it openly. But it's this ambiguity which leaves us in a kind of nowhere land, which we don't know where we're standing right now. And but I think that López Obrador has struck a chord in a very meaningful way with a subject that is I'm seeing it right now here in Colombia, which is to attending the causes. And even though the cause that leads somebody to commit an illegitimate or an illegal activity, attacking the cause, not the consequence, sort of speaking.
Mm-hmm.
And so I have to admit it, I'm a fierce critic of López Obrador in many ways, but there's some he has been talking about the same thing during a long time, and I think it's about time to embrace that narrative and to embrace that debate and to analyze, in specifically talking about López Obrador, how many of that has been talk and narrative and discourse, and how actually it has go down to especially to the poorest parts of Mexico, the parts where much people have to look to illegal activities as a means to survive. And how has it actually become a reality? Is it more of a discourse or a narrative, or has it been a true effect behind that discourse? And actually, that I want to talk about something that Oswaldo said. This change that in the Merida Initiative, the bicentennial agreement, if I'm not mistaken, that's the name. I want to see if that's really is going to be a change, or if it's going to be just a facade, just a change in the name, sort of like the National Guard, which was like the big answer of López Obrador to fight organized crime, and it was just like a paint job on the same security enterprise that was Policía Federal, but that functions in the very same way. I don't know if I'm being clear. Like, what's real and what's narrative? That's the main question that I ask right now with López Obrador efforts in this subject.
Yeah, and I think that's what most, that is the big question, because and he's very good at terms, primero los pobres, first the poor, hugs not
the
poets.
Greatest.
It's these terms that he's able to throw out there. But that's the big question. What would be the change? And so when we're thinking about this next step in international cooperation, how are you analyzing this, Oswaldo, as what is, they're supposed to present it in January. What can we expect from this new document that will come out? What are the issues that are maybe being discussed? Does it forecast a change?
Well, the bicentennial agreement already foreshadows a lot of, in language at least, and I share Daniel's suspicion that this may remain just clearly on the surface and not in substance. But there's a couple other dimensions to this that I would like to add. As it is true that López Obrador constantly talks about the causes of drug trafficking being poverty and social injustice and so forth. There's a problem that I believe he, at least at the beginning of his campaign and in the first months of his presidency, pointed at, which was, of course, the security paradigm itself, right? And the idea of the militarization. He kept announcing that the military, the armed forces will go back to the headquarters, that he would demilitarize the country, and of course the opposite has happened. However, while saying this, it comes to me, at least as I revise all these different events in the last 3 years, that perhaps he moved from a very genuine desire of demilitarizing the country to a more, I don't know how to name it, but perhaps a more nuanced, just to be generous, strategy of hijacking the national security agenda of the U.S. And by this, of course, I don't want to say that I'm in favor of this new idea of the militarization, but I do find it interesting to a point. For example, the idea of using the military, as I mentioned in my intervention, right, to move on to all these different projects, infrastructure projects, many of them connected to energy. And following, of course, Dawn Paley's brilliant work in her two books and other colleagues who have touched on this, energy is perhaps one of the main reasons of a lot of the violence. Right, there's a lot of the links that have been established by journalists and academics, and that prove that there's a correlation between the militarization and the extractive projects that went on, especially during the Peña Nieto presidency. So it seems to me that in a very interesting way, a lot of the new AMLO militarization process has to do with hijacking or rearranging the energy map of Mexico, right? And I think this is why a conference just solely devoted to organized crime, in my view, falls short, right? Because you can no longer think of security issues just in isolation, as if they were not connected to the broad geopolitics in the region, especially when it comes to the extractive industry. And so we need to bring those two together and always think, as Dawn mentioned, from a very interdisciplinary way. So thinking the two processes, the way they're represented and discussed, and when you then moved into exactly where the military is moving and where is it that they're going, what projects are they favoring? For example, the idea of the Istmo de Tehuantepec, the interoceanic corridor, the clean energy projects that are going on there. They also have to do with depopulation of entire regions. And it seems to me then that, and I venture this, of course, without any evidence yet, but it seems to me that the process of militarization and energy are becoming a single paradigm of a new security agenda that López Obrador is placing forward against some of the most recurrent transnational interests, but perhaps opening, of course, to other possibilities of corruption and cronyism, as I mentioned. But in any case, opposing some form of resistance from this global South that used to be just passive, against the flow of this agenda. Again, I'm not qualifying it. I'm not trying to put a moral value to it. I'm just simply thinking, that together, the new militarization that moves around these infrastructure projects, and then the move to call the infrastructure projects national security matters, then seals, a new kind of like a governmentality where militarism and energy come hand in hand.
Yeah, and I'm going to let you come in, Dawn. Don't worry. I mean, really quick, just the thing also about this possibility of about the possibility of national security projects, of them being denominated national security projects, is also because then there's a lack of a need of transparency if they aren't under that radar. And so I think it's important for us to at least say that, it's also, but the question is, and this, Dawn, if you want to answer, you can, or you can just respond to what you were going to respond to, is he giving these projects to the military because they're asking for it? Is he the one who is leading this, or are they the ones who are asking for it? Who is, who's leading this new hegemonic change that you're proposing, that I think we are seeing in practice? Dawn.
Well, yeah, so I wanted to just quickly respond to both Luis Daniel and Oswaldo, and just add to what they were mentioning. So I think in terms of attending to the causes or attacking the root causes, I think one of the problems with the way that discourse is often presented is that it responsibilizes individuals, and especially really marginalized folks, folks who are actually most vulnerable to experiencing violence related to the war on drugs, for the violence that they're experiencing. I would be interested in a conversation about attending the root causes, and this touches just on what Oswaldo started saying. Attending the root causes, let's talk about U.S. military relationships with Mexican military. Let's talk about the U.S. training the Mexican Navy. Let's talk about the Mexican Army. Let's talk about the National Guard. Those, in my opinion, those are the root causes. And so the root cause discussion should go structural, but it tends to go individual and refocus the blame again for the drug war on the poorest people in Mexico, right? So I think we need to be very careful about adopting or engaging uncritically with that idea of root causes. And then I'm interested in Oswaldo's perspective on the declaration of these mega projects. We actually don't know exactly what is going to be covered under the declaration that these will be parts of national security. One thing I was reading Serena's most recent, the Mexican Army's most recent annual report, and the National Guard is actually a priority project of this government. So theoretically, the bases that they're building, which are being challenged by communities, from Coyoacán to the highlands of Chiapas, could also be forced through under this kind of decree. But I think one thing that I'd like to bring into that discussion, I think we'd be remiss to not mention, is, I can sort of see where Oswaldo's coming from in terms of this positioning of like a kind of an energy sovereignty position. But there's also migration, right? There's also the fact that we now have soldiers and National Guard patrolling the north and south border and the whole country. Like there's checkpoints all over the place. And that does not seem to have, that seems like a concession that this government has been willing to make almost since the beginning, of basically throwing non-Mexican migrants under the bus and making it acceptable for them to be shot at, to be policed by state security forces within that kind of same discourse of national security. So I think I'd just like to put that on the table as well.
I mean, this is my own hypothesis. I may be wrong, but I believe, answering Sarah's question about is the military asking for these roles or is AMLO giving to them? I believe it's the second one. That's my own point of view. Why I say this? Because there has been a lot of instances since at least 15 years ago of him, showing some disregard or distrust towards traditional institutions. He has used several times that the government, this phrase that the government is like a sick elephant, that you have to move slowly. And I think he views the military as a way of cutting a few corners in the way of implementation of certain things. I'm not saying that I'm in favor of that, but the bureaucracy and the red tape it's an illness that affects every single government. And I believe that his approach of giving the military these roles allow him to operate more freely without a lot of supervision and avoiding a lot of processes on the way. I think it's a practical way of him to operate. That's at least my hypothesis. And in this idea of viewing this whole situation as a whole, not just as using those labels that we were talking about, I agree with Oswaldo, but I also thinking about attending the causes. It goes in the same way. You have to attend the causes. You have to act, in my opinion, at least, as a whole state, not just depend on some security forces to act and then leave those communities that were affected or that were que fueron intervenidas in a certain way. For instance, what I was talking about here in Colombia, there's a lot of discourse and narrative talking about, yes, using the power of the force and the security forces to enforce the law, yes, but that has to come hand in hand with better access to education, to entrepreneurship, to access to justice, to truth to the victims, to giving way to infrastructure projects that can help these remote communities to access more easily to schools, to the highway system. That's like what I think about when we talk about attending the causes, to act as a whole, not just in addressing the problem as a whole, but viewing the solution as a whole, not just as a matter of security, as a matter of illegality, it's just as a matter of a state acting to solve a problem.
If I could just add, I think one of the root causes that we haven't mentioned is also prohibition, right? And especially in a conference like this, it needs to be mentioned. And unfortunately, the current administration has proven unwilling to even legalize or decriminalize, fully decriminalize marijuana, right? So I think that's another one to touch on.
And if I could add very quickly, just to Don's previous comment, with which I totally agree. The Lopez Obrador government, by adopting this anti-immigrant stance on both the southern and the northern border, which is not only heartbreaking, but in violation of international law in many cases. It's also, I think, another aspect of this hijacking of the national security agenda that I'm talking about, right? In the sense that even though it's in alignment with what the Donald Trump and of course now the Joe Biden administration are pushing forward, it also seems to benefit and to expand his favor publicly. As we've seen, he continues to prove popular in most polls. Just today he had a massive rally in the Zócalo, but also at the same time, of course, it allows him to I guess facilitate into be complacent with the military's activities in those regions, right? The same goes for controlling the customs ports of entry, or by administrating and also taking the money from the benefits of the Mexico City airport. So it seems to me that it continues to be a win-win situation that has proven as an effective formula of the national security paradigm all over the planet, right? I mean, this is what Jeff Halper, and this is why I keep coming back to his book called the global Palestine paradigm, right? The idea of implementing multi-checkpoints all over the country, and militarizing your own territory as a means of government. But he's doing it in order to advance his own agenda, right? And one of them, of course, is totally contradictory to other geopolitical interests, the one on energy sovereignty. So again, I'm not saying that any of these processes are morally acceptable or even something that is desirable. But it seems to me that if we think of them in conjunction, all together at the same time, we may see AMLO's if you want sinister or effective at the same time security agenda that in some aspects falls in line with the global trends, and in others brings forward the opportunity to build and to develop important central aspects of his presidency, like the one on the commitment on energy sovereignty.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, one of the things that I think we need to say, and also obviously, I work primarily on drug policy, so prohibition is definitely one of the pieces that we're working to overturn as a way of it forming part of a change. But as Don said, we have not even been able to take one step without the government putting obstacles in the way. And in fact, it's been civil society that has really pushed any sort of change, although there is discourse. There's different discourse that happen depending on the political moment, from Olga Sanchez Cordero, Ricardo Monreal, or even from the president. But one of the things is that supposedly, and this is a question, like, will this happen? In March 2024, there is supposed to be a demilitarization, according to the law that was put in, according to the decreto that created the National Guard. And so are we being naive in thinking that might even happen? Because so much of the fights and so much of the fights on all of these projects have been in courts. And so that is also his means of putting things under the national security umbrella, allows him to go forward with those without being subjected to being sued by other actors. And so this is something where I think we need to be wondering, is because there's a lot of, he has high approval ratings. I voted for him in the last, that is who we voted for, and we had a lot of hopes, but there was also a lot of disappointment. What will be some of these key moments in the future that we need to be thinking about in the next 3 years? And it's interesting that we're having this conversation exactly, 3 years from when he took office. And one would think, we should be talking about, long ago past, but these 3 years have felt almost like a decade in all of the changes that have happened. And and maybe the consolidation of some of these things that you all are touching on of, how are they protecting extractive industries? And is that then an incorporation between the military and private sector, or are you giving more power to the private sector? And if you do it all under the umbrella of national security, we actually might never know. And so what is the scenario that we might see playing out around some of these ever-changing dynamics that you all have been picking up on throughout your conversations? Because I know we have about 5 minutes left, so I feel like we could kind of end in that forward thinking. Anyone who wants to pick up can. Or
sure, I would. I just draw attention to a new program announced today between the U.S. and Mexico. It's called Sembrando Oportunidades, and it's supposed to be an extension of one of the hallmark programs of the López Obrador administration, Sembrando Vida, and the military's role in that, right? So we didn't see anything about the military's role. It's rarely talked about, their role in Sembrando Vida. But I think we should pay attention to how, I just saw a note that says we have 20 minutes, so I'm going to take a bit longer than I was going to do, like a 30-second wrap up. But
take as long as, it's really as long as you guys feel like you can be here, because they had told me an hour, but now that we have more time, we can have.
They just, I don't know. Okay.
Go for it.
Anyways, I think there has been, since the Peña Nieto administration, an increased participation by the Mexican military in international peacekeeping, quote unquote, peacekeeping missions. So currently there's Mexican military officials in numerous countries in Africa, for example. And so I think for me, that would be one thing to look at. Fernando Escalante Gonzalo has an excellent column at the beginning of this year in Nexos, where he basically says there's no turning back from this in terms of the military's increased participation in civilian life and these guaranteed revenues that they're getting, right? Like, we're being told now that the Corredor Transísmico and the Tren Maya is going to be administered by long-term by the army for the purpose of guaranteeing their pension funds, right? So this is a long-term plan. It's very interesting, and I'd be very interested to hear what Oswaldo and Luis Daniel and you have thought about this, Zara, of sort of using the military in the discourse as a way to protect sort of, it's a kind of nationalization where the army is the only institution within Mexico that can guarantee that the Tren Maya, the Aeropuerto Santa Lucia, the Corredor Transísmico will stay in state hands is by giving it to the military. I think that's an extremely risky, extremely dangerous idea. And it's something to me that seems very permanent, right? You're talking about this is going to pay their pensions, right? So this is not thinking about like a 3-year plan. This is thinking about 30 years in the future when the soldiers who are coming in today are starting to retire. So I think paying attention to where soldiers are deployed. For example, if Mexican soldiers are no longer to be deployed to this extent within Mexico, will they begin participating in different contexts in Central America or in so-called peacekeeping missions overseas? I would say that's something to pay attention to.
I would add to Don's point, talking about this subject of how in the discourse he's using the militarization as a way of protecting some subjects. I would add that López Obrador has been a quite successful politician in a way, thanks to his interpretation and his analysis of the public feeling, and that comes in the way of how is the people looking or viewing a certain thing that is going on in the country. And I would add to this that even though in Mexico, as well as in pretty much the whole world, the public institutions are going through a crisis, a confidence crisis, a trust crisis, in Mexico, one of the few institutions that carry on having a relatively stable level of trust among the citizens and among the people in general are the armed forces, which I also believe that plays a part in López Obrador using them as a way of shielding certain projects or certain ideas, certain approaches, certain policies, using the military to as a deterrent of avoiding some criticism about people. And to close, I would like to, what I'm really interested in seeing in the coming years are the main results of these social programs in which López Obrador has invested quite a lot of his political capital and discourse, especially this sort of programs that were actually aimed at, among other things, to reducing the probability of vulnerable populations to going into criminal enterprises. And right now, it's all hypothesis. We don't have the results. The results about how many people have improved their conditions of living through Sembrando Vida, through all these scholarships, and this whole branch of social programs that López Obrador implemented, to see if it was all a really well-managed discourse that didn't actually materialize, or if what I'm most interested about in the coming years.
Should I respond?
Yeah, please.
Okay. Well, thinking along the lines of Don's last intervention, I was thinking of how under neoliberal governance, the army was traditionally instrumentalized for the population, for facilitating transnational extractive industries, for terrorizing, of course, entire communities, and for opening up. And I think I'm using one of Dawn's keywords in her book, opening up markets, in the global South. Of course, this is very temporary and very risky, as Dawn said, but the López Obrador government seems to have implemented a reversal of this traditional use of the army, right? In the sense that it has become somewhat of a public branch of institutional growth, and for, of course, administering some of the most important infrastructure projects. This being said, of course, and I share completely Dawn's preoccupation with the fact that this, of course, is long-term, and there is no end in sight, even though it's, of course, projected in the Constitution of the National Guard that by 2024, right, the army would be fully out of security tasks, and that the National Guard itself would have become some form of a civil security armed force, But in the end, as we're seeing, it just takes consensus in Congress to change or to postpone those dates, right? And I don't think we have seen differently, especially from the transition, the official transition of the National Guard back to Sedena, right? Back to the army leadership. Of course, it never left army leadership, but it just simply became officially now completely, fully under the command of the military. And of course, for as much as this worries me and it keeps me at bay, with understanding the ultimate direction of the López Obrador policies, it seems to me that there are very few other alternatives in the neoliberal era that we're facing, right? If López Obrador had entertained the total dismantling of military power in the first years, even first months of his presidency, I doubt that a lot of his projects would have survived. Perhaps even his presidency would have entered some form of crisis. And by administering, by shifting the roles of the military, as we have seen, it seems to me that he's opting out for some form of middle ground in which he is accepting some of the security roles of the military, especially the ones we mentioned on the anti-migrant policy that is so disheartening. But on the other hand, it comes also as a force that is trustworthy for undertaking these massive projects that require not only the expertise, of course, but the viability of a state institution branch that can actually carry it through, right? As opposed to outsourcing it to the private sector, which would take you back to the original logic of neoliberal governance. So I'm not saying that with this that he's evading neoliberalism at any sort. I'm thinking simply like, and I think I like that word for now, hijacking it. It seems to me like an interesting way of naming it, because it seems to me that he's taking the leadership over them, to move them in accordance to his own project. So this goes also back to the question that you were posing before, in the sense that I don't think it's the military calling the shots, but it's actually a fully authoritarian and in control presidency that is accepting its contradictions, and it's moving forward with the main focuses that it's choosing. And for me, one of them, of course, is energy and energy reform. And to this last point, it's fascinating how this whole panel, that it's within a conference of organized crime, has fallen so far away from the idea of organized crime. And I think that's a sign of nuance and a good debate, because I think we definitely need to move way past the idea that the main concern in Mexico is somehow, a bunch of armed groups that they call themselves Cartel Jalisco Nueva Generación, because they're worrying about how to take fentanyl to the U.S.-Mexico border. I think there's far more than that, and that we need to open up that discussion, right? And so, finally, just to go back to the expectations that you're setting forward for 2024. I do not anticipate that the military will be out of course, a public life, but I do hope for not only just a reduction of violence, but a gradual reconfiguration of the security paradigm itself, right? And perhaps we have seen a little bit of that in some of the decisions that have been made early in the presidency, namely, for example, the refusal to detain El Chapo's son to prevent, the killing of people in Culiacan. I think that was the right call, and perhaps the question of some of the most conflicted areas. The one, for example, in Michoacan, and especially in the town of Aguililla, where a lot of scholars are arguing that that narcos are in control, or the narcos have suspended the sovereignty of the state. What we're seeing is some sort of at least hesitance in the necro politics of the previous governments, right? And that, for me, if not an answer, at least it's some form of hope, right? That the fact that this government refuses to kill as a form of governing or as a form of security policy, it's somewhat of a positive sign. Again, I'm not saying that this is not happening anymore, because there are clear signs that it is happening, but in public discourse, or at least in public policy and in López Obrador's mind, it's not something that is desirable. So I'm thinking that perhaps we're heading into that difficult balance of allowing the military so much power and liberty that they conduct these raids and these anti-drug policies perhaps on their own. The Culiacan situation seems to have been conducted without the president's knowledge, which is also very worrisome. But on the other hand, the president thinking that the way to move forward is way beyond the kingpin strategy and just the idea of the war against drugs altogether.
Yeah, I mean, these are big questions that we're kind of bringing up. And I'm thinking about, are there even incentives to change the security paradigm? I mean, have we even seen is this a real shift? No, I'm not sure that he's the one who's calling all of the shots. I'm not convinced. I think that there is a different kind of relationship there. And as oftentimes when you enter power, maybe you don't know all of the dynamics that you're going to be coming up against when that happens to you. And one of the things that I want to, when we think about the future, and then Don, I'm not sure if you want to respond to some of the comments that were made, and then we'll wrap up, is, how are we going to be thinking about what happened with Cienfuegos? Was that a presidential pardon without it being called a presidential pardon? Can we envision a world in Mexico where there is this interconnectedness between state and folks who are engaged in illegal economies and also engaged in legal economies, being able to have pardons offered to them in exchange for letting go of certain activities, in exchange for no longer producing fentanyl and only producing legal substances that have now been regulated by the state. It's that, because I am an optimist at heart, and so one wants to think that with some policy changes, we could have that clandestine activities no longer be that, and that there could be it could be much more clear, because the confusion that has been around all of these actions, and anytime you hear about any interaction between the state and a community, or the state and a group, they're thriving on the confusion that's generated around that. And so it's one of these things of, when we think about the future, how, whether presidential pardons will be part of that future as a means of recognizing these, and I appreciate the questioning of this conference, because that's why I wanted to have this panel, because I wanted to have a panel that was questioning how the basis of this conference. And so I'm really pleased with the conversation we've had, because it leaves us with much more nuanced framework to really think about this. And probably we could keep going on. I have other things that could go on, but whether what is really at the forefront for AMLO, is it his social programs, or is it these infrastructure programs? Where is he seeing the power? He wants to be loved, and so that's the social programs, but he has an idea and an ideology that he's pushing, and that's the infrastructure project. So I feel like even within himself, there's this duality that's playing out, that is playing out in the country as a whole. So I don't know if anyone wants to have a last comment, and before they take us away.
I would just caution against the idea that the army is transitioning into this other sphere of activities. They're expanding into another sphere of activities while maintaining, this month is the record of soldiers patrolling the streets, mm-hmm. right? More than 80,000. So it's actually increasing the national security paradigm of war on drugs, and expanding. So I think that is extremely worrying. Those things
80,000 only Sedena, right? 80,000, yeah. I think it's only Sedena. We're not counting Marinos or Guardia Nacional, which is even, doubles up that figure, right? I share that preoccupation completely.
Yeah, and I think it's something that we need to think about. I mean, a lot of us there are certain indicios, there's certain hints that maybe there are things that, that have not yet become state policy, but where, the Truth Commission on the dirty war in Mexico. Okay, we can celebrate that that's happening. That's been pushed for by victims. And that's what's hard. It's hard to know when things are being done because there's a political will to open the country to have this kind of conversation about truth and justice and reparations and reconciliation. And then when is it something that is only happening because you're pushed against, and because you can no longer say no? Because the dirty war was a long time ago, but all of this continues to happen. So have we really had that transition that we would need to? Is there a politician that can come at the future who might hold that space? Or would it, what will be kind of this future of the left and what comes out when there is greater transparency on what's going on? I know we only have 1 minute left. And so I just want to thank you for a lovely conversation on this Wednesday night. And by lovely, I mean terrific, because we don't know what's going to happen. And I think that there are a lot of people who are suffering, and that's what's mm-hmm. the hardest part, because mm-hmm. there's a lot of pain that is not being addressed in this mm-hmm. country. And every day, I feel like it's 91 people are killed on a daily basis. There are several women that are killed every day on a daily basis. So we are living we've normalized these violence levels. And so it's no longer, there were more homicides this year than last year. It keeps happening. And we're not questioning why or how do we shift that. And so I want to thank you for having that conversation. And I hope that within the conference, maybe they can also look at how they're framing this conversation, this global conversation, and how we can all of those who are participating be a bit more intentional in how we're framing it, and a bit more critical of how we think about these topics. So thank you, the three of you, for joining at this hour. And
thanks so much, Zara.
Thank you, Sarah.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you,
Thank
Sarah.
you all. Thank you for everything. Thank you.
Thanks a lot. Have a good evening.
Thank you for listening to the OC24 podcast. For more talks, have a look at the podcast feed on whichever platform you use. There are loads more to listen to. Video versions of these talks are also available on the Global Initiative Against Transnational Organised Crime YouTube channel. If you would like to share these talks around, we ask that you use the hashtag OC24 and let us know what you think. The 24-hour conference on global organised crime is brought to you by the European Consortium of Political Research Standing Group on Organised Crime, the Centre for Information and Research on Organised Crime, the International Association for the Study of Organised Crime, and the Global Initiative Against Transnational Organised Crime. For more information, head over to oc24.globalinitiative.net. This has been the OC24 podcast from the Global Initiative Against Transnational Organised Crime. Thanks for listening.